Hello again, and welcome back to History for Today. Today, I'm going to talk for my U.S. History 2 students primarily about the period between the mid-1960s and just before 1980. Which, although a lot of very good things happened during this period of time, is typically thought of as a period of kind of unraveling and ultimately malaise when America faces some problems that it hadn't had to deal with before. To some extent, they are the consequences of decisions and actions that we had taken. But in a large way, they're very unanticipated, and they come to a lot of Americans as a kind of a surprise and a challenging shock. So let's take a look at those. But let's begin with the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. Although Lyndon Johnson was 54 years old when he became president, or about 9 years older than President Kennedy had been, who had been the youngest American president up to that time, he did seem like a member of an older generation. And this was partially because he was a member of an older political generation. John F. Kennedy had entered politics as a congressman in 1947 after serving in World War II. Johnson had actually been in Washington since 1931. First as a legislative secretary to a Texas representative, and then in 1937 as a congressman himself in his own right. So Johnson was already in Washington when Franklin Roosevelt arrived, and he became an ally of the new Democratic president, the first Democratic president in quite a while, as you recall. And he became an ardent supporter also of Roosevelt's New Deal. President Lyndon Johnson, interestingly, a white Southerner with a thick Texas drawl, and an understanding of Washington that he had developed over 18 years spent in the House, and then another dozen in the Senate, including as majority leader, was in a very good position to move legislation along. And he embraced the civil rights movement. Johnson had already managed passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960 when he had been Senate Majority Leader. And then after Kennedy's assassination and his own inauguration as president, he took up Kennedy's stalled 1963 Civil Rights Bill. He strengthened it, and he navigated it through Congress. The following summer, he signed that Civil Rights Act of 1964. Which is thought of by most historians as one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. It was a comprehensive act that barred segregation in public accommodations and outlawed discrimination based on race, gender, and national or religious origin or affiliation. So very wide-ranging, kind of sweeping legislation. The civil rights movement created this space, and the pressure that the civil rights movement put on politicians created a space for political leaders to pass this kind of legislation. And the movement kept pushing forward. Direct action continued through the summer of 1964 as student-run organizations like SNCC and the Congress for Racial Equality began what they called the Freedom Summer Drive in Mississippi, where they registered African American voters in a state that had had a very, very ugly history of discrimination and voter suppression. In March of 1965, activists decided to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to support local African American voting rights. A few weeks earlier, a 26-year-old black man named Jimmy Lee Jackson had been shot by state troopers during a voting rights demonstration when he had tried to protect his mother from police who were beating her. On March 7th, which came to be called Bloody Sunday. Civil rights leaders, including John Lewis, the 25-year-old SNCC leader, who later became a congressman, of course, planned this 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, where Governor George Wallace was continuing to lead the opposition to civil and to voting rights. As they left Selma, the marchers were attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and Edmund Pettus was a Confederate hero, of course. And they were attacked on this bridge by white law officers with batons and with tear gas. Television cameras actually captured the brutal beatings and the tear gas attacks on these peaceful marchers. And they also captured cheering white crowds waving Confederate battle flags. The film was flown to New York City, where ABC News interrupted the network's broadcast of the blockbuster movie Judgment at Nuremberg with a special report on this violence. 50 million Americans who had tuned in to watch this star-studded courtroom drama about Nazi atrocities instead got to watch uniformed American policemen behaving like German stormtroopers, following orders to brutalize their fellow Americans. Pulitzer Prize winning authors Gene Roberts and Hank Klibanoff, who chronicled the civil rights movement in an award-winning book called The Race Beat, wrote that, in their words, the juxtaposition struck like psychological lightning in American homes. Coverage of the march actually prompted President Johnson to present the bill that ultimately became the Voting Rights Act of 1965, abolishing voting discrimination in federal, state, and local elections. On a May morning in 1964, speaking to graduates at the University of Michigan, President Johnson had laid out a sweeping vision for a package of domestic reforms that he called the Great Society. Johnson wanted to see an end to poverty and racial injustice, in his words, and he challenged Americans to, as he said, enrich and elevate our national life and advance the quality of our American civilization. The Great Society's legislation was really wide-ranging and breathtaking in scope, and many of its programs and agencies are still with us today, not unlike the New Deal. In addition to civil rights, the Great Society took on a range of quality of life concerns that seemed suddenly solvable in this new society of affluence in post-war America. It established the first federal food stamp program, Medicare and Medicaid to ensure access to quality medical care. And in 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was the first significant federal investment in public education, and it totaled more than $1 billion, which was a lot of money at the time. The Great Society also established the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which then created public television stations. Johnson's domestic agenda largely focused on the $3 billion allocation for the War on Poverty programming within the Great Society's Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. No EOA program was more controversial than the one called Community Action, which was the cornerstone of the anti-poverty program. Community action programs would give disenfranchised Americans a seat at the table in not only receiving aid, but in planning and executing federally funded programs. Despite widespread support for most Great Society programs, the War on Poverty and Community Action increasingly became the focal point for domestic criticism. As racial unrest and violence continued to sweep across the country and moved to urban centers, critics from the right lambasted federal spending on people they considered unworthy citizens. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Acts, the Voting Rights Act, and the War on Poverty provoked very strong conservative resistance and were catalysts for the rise of Republican resistance in the South and the West. However, later presidents and Congresses have actually left intact a lot of that Great Society legislation, including Medicare and Medicaid, food stamps, and federal spending for arts and literature and education programs like Head Start. Even community action programs inspired a new generation of community activists who had never before felt, as one of them put it, that this government is with us. So a lot of good came from Johnson's Great Society. American involvement in the Vietnam War began during a post-war period of decolonization. The Soviet Union backed many nationalist movements across the globe that were fighting to get out from under colonial, especially European colonial regimes. But the United States feared this potential expansion of communism and of Soviet influence, and it pledged to confront any of these revolutions that seemed to attack Western capitalism. But it was often difficult to know when a revolutionary movement actually opposed capitalism or whether it was just opposing Western imperialism. American foreign policy was guided by this domino theory, the idea that if one country fell into communism, then the neighboring states would surely soon follow, would fall like dominoes. After the communist takeover of China in 1949, the victory of Mao and his Chinese Communist Party, the United States decided to support the French Empire's effort to regain control over its colonies in what they called French Indochina, which were Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Largely because the leaders of the revolution against the French had some ties with communism. And the backstory here is interesting. In 1945, at the end of World War II, after having led the resistance to the Japanese occupation, a Vietnamese revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh issued a declaration of independence for this region that had been known as French Indochina, based, of course, on the American Declaration of 1776. Ho Chi Minh, who lived from 1890 to 1969, and who had embraced Marxism while living in Europe in the 1920s, had led the resistance to the Japanese occupation during the war years. And his declaration began by quoting the famous American statement that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are literally the first words of the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. Between 1946 and 1954, France tried to regain their colonies and fought a counterinsurgency campaign against the nationalist Viet Minh forces led by Ho Chi Minh. The United States assisted the French with funds and arms and advisors. But it wasn't enough. And in 1954, Viet Minh forces defeated the French army at Dien Bien Phu. A peace conference in Geneva temporarily divided Vietnam into two separate states until UN-monitored elections could be held. Apparently, they didn't learn anything from Korea. But the United States was aware that Ho Chi Minh was hugely popular throughout the region and was most likely to win the election and become the elected president of a new unified nation. And so they blocked the elections. The temporary partition became permanent, and the United States established the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, and installed a prime minister named Diem, who was known to be friendly to United States interests. Diem's government, however, lacked any real popular support. and it couldn't contain the communist insurgency that was still seeking the reunification of Vietnam. Which, again, this was an artificial division of Vietnam. So there was no prior tradition of these two regions being separate. The U.S. provided weapons and support again, but the South Vietnamese failed to defeat the Viet Cong insurgents. Diem himself was assassinated in 1963, and then a series of military dictators followed as the situation in South Vietnam continued to deteriorate politically. The American public remained largely unaware at this time of Vietnam in the early 1960s, even as President John F. Kennedy was secretly deploying 16,000 military advisors to help South Vietnam focus on suppressing this domestic communist insurgency. However, in August of 1964, after Johnson was in the White House, the USS Maddox reported incoming fire from North Vietnamese ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Although the details of the incident are still controversial, the Johnson administration exploited this event to escalate American involvement in Vietnam. Congress quickly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Johnson the authority to deploy additional American military units to defend South Vietnam. U.S. Marines landed in Vietnam in March of 1965, and the American ground war began. But no matter how many troops the Americans sent over or how many bombs they dropped, they couldn't win. This was a different kind of war. Progress wasn't measured by cities won or by territory taken, but by body counts and kill ratios. Although American officials like U.S. General William Westmoreland and the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, claimed a communist defeat was on the horizon, coming any day now. By 1968, 500,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam, and nearly 20,000 had been killed, and the war was still no closer to being won. Protests, which would provide a backdrop for the American counterculture in the second half of the 1960s, began to erupt across the country. Now, despite substantial legislative achievements in civil rights, a lot of frustrations with the slow pace grew amongst activists. Tensions continued to mount in cities, which were plagued by riots almost every summer throughout the 60s. And the tone of the civil rights movement began to change. Activists became less conciliatory and gradualist, and many embraced a more militant message of the Black Power movement and of Malcolm X, a Nation of Islam minister who encouraged African Americans to pursue their freedom and equality and justice by any means necessary. Prior to his assassination in 1965, Malcolm X had emerged as a radical alternative to the racially integrated, largely Protestant approach of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Protestant minister. Malcolm advocated armed resistance to defend the safety of Black American families, stating, "I don't call it violence when it's self-defense, I call it intelligence." King and mainstream organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League actually criticized Malcolm X for what they called racial demagoguery. King believed that Malcolm's speeches were a great disservice to Black Americans because he said Malcolm complained about the problems of African Americans without offering solutions. The differences between King and Malcolm X created an ideological tension that split Black political thought throughout the 60s and the early 70s. By the late 1960s, a radicalized SNCC, the original Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by figures such as Stokely Carmichael, had begun expelling its white members and had moved from interracial efforts in the South and begun focusing instead on problems in northern cities. SNCC activists became frustrated with institutional tactics, and they turned away from the organization's founding principle of nonviolence. They wanted African Americans to play a lead role in cultivating Black institutions and in articulating Black interest, rather than relying on interracial moderate approaches, oftentimes led by whites. At a June 1966 civil rights march, Carmichael told the crowd, "What we're going to start saying now is Black power." The slogan not only resonated with the audience, it also stood in direct contrast to King's Freedom Now campaign. Carmichael asserted that Black power means Black people coming together to form a political force. But to others, it meant violence. In 1966, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. The Black Panthers became standard bearers for direct action and for self-defense to liberate Black communities from white power structures. The revolutionary organization also it wanted reparations, and it wanted exemptions for Black men from military service. They wanted to prevent Black men from being drafted. And citing police brutality and racist government policies, the Black Panthers aligned themselves with what they called other people of color in the world that America was fighting abroad. Although it was mostly known for, and is mostly remembered for, its open display of weapons and its apparent willingness to fight, in its military-style dress and Black nationalist beliefs, the party's 10-point plan also included things like employment and housing and education. The Black Panthers worked in local communities to run survival programs that provided food and clothing and medical treatment and drug rehab to residents. They focused on modes of resistance that they thought empowered Black activists on their own terms. But African Americans weren't the only minority groups struggling to assert themselves in the 1960s. The success of the civil rights movement and of grassroots activism in general inspired many new movements. In the summer of 1961, for example, frustrated Native American university students founded the National Indian Youth Council to draw attention to the problems faced by Indigenous Americans. In the Pacific Northwest, the council advocated for tribal fishermen to have immunity from conservation laws on reservations. And in 1964, they held a series of fish-ins where activists would cast nets into the water and wait for the police to arrest them. The National Indian Youth Council's militant rhetoric and their use of direct action began what was called a Red Power movement, an intertribal movement designed to draw attention to Native issues and to protest discrimination. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, and other activists began staging dramatic demonstrations and occupations. In November of 1969, dozens of them began a year-and-a-half-long occupation of the abandoned prison on the island of Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay. In 1973, hundreds occupied the town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota, which had been the site of an infamous 1890 Indian massacre, and they stayed there for several months as well. Meanwhile, the Chicano movement of the 1960s emerged out of the broader Mexican-American civil rights movement of the post-war era. The movement confronted discrimination in schools, in politics, in agriculture especially, and in other institutions as well. Organizations like the Mexican American Political Association and the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund patterned themselves after similar programs in the Black Civil Rights Movement. Cesar Chavez became the most well-known figure of the Chicano movement when he used nonviolent tactics to campaign for farm workers' rights in the grape fields of California. Chavez and his partner activist Dolores Huerta founded the National Farm Workers Association, which eventually became the United Farm Workers of America. The United Farm Workers fused the causes of Filipino and Chicano activists protesting the exploitation of workers on California farms. In addition to leading a hunger strike and a boycott of table grapes, Chavez led a 300-mile march in March and April 1966 from Delano on the southern end of California's agricultural Central Valley to the state capital of Sacramento, which is on the northern end. The pro-labor campaign received national attention and the support of prominent political figures such as Robert Kennedy. Chavez's birthday, March 31st, is still observed as a federal holiday in California and Colorado and Texas. The feminist movement also grew in the 1960s. Women were active in both the civil rights movement and in the labor movement, but their increasing awareness of gender inequality led some women to begin forming a movement of their own. Like the early civil rights activists, an older generation of women who preferred to work within state institutions were prominent in the early part of the decade, in the early movement. For example, when John F. Kennedy had established a presidential commission on the status of women in 1961, former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt had headed the effort. The commission's report found discriminatory provisions in the practices of industrial and labor and government organizations, and had advocated for changes, many of them long overdue, in the conditions of women's opportunity in the United States. I was quoting there. Change was recommended in employment practices, in federal tax and benefit policies that affected women's income, in labor laws, and in services for women who were wives and mothers and workers. But while these actions would help the types of discrimination primarily experienced by middle-class white working women, who were used to advocating through institutional structures like government agencies and unions, the concerns of poor and non-white women were largely beyond the scope of this report. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, hit bookshelves in the same year, 1963, that the commission released this report. Friedan had been active in the union movement and was a mother in the new suburban landscape of post-war America. She helped many white middle-class American women recognize their dissatisfaction as housewives. And she told them that this was not something that was wrong with their marriages or themselves, but instead was a social problem that was experienced by millions of American women. Friedan said there was a discrepancy. In her words, there's a discrepancy between the reality of our lives as women and the image to which we are trying to conform, the image I call the feminine mystique. So women were no longer content to blame their frustration on loss of femininity, on too much education, or on too much female independence and equality. But again, middle-class white women were not the only activists addressing issues. Mothers on welfare began to form local advocacy groups, in addition to the National Welfare Rights Organization that had been founded in 1966. Mostly African American, these activists fought for greater benefits and for more control over welfare policy and implementation. Women like Johnny Tillman fought for larger grants for school clothes and for household equipment, in addition to trying to gain due process and fair administrative hearings prior to the cutting off termination of welfare entitlements. At the end of the decade, activists organized for the Women's Strike for Equality, which was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of women's right to vote. It was sponsored by the National Organization for Women, NOW, and this 1970 protest focused on employment discrimination, political equality, abortion, free childcare, and equality in marriage. In 1971, Michigan Congressperson Martha Wright Griffiths reintroduced a proposal for an Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, which passed the House in 1971 and then passed the Senate in early 1972 and went out to the states for ratification. It did fail to get enough states and didn't get ratified. ERA and many of the specific rights that women's activists claimed, such as the right to abortion, became the focus of a backlash led by conservative women and by men who valued the traditional homemaker status that feminists were rejecting. The feminist movement would also begin to fracture internally in the 1970s as minority women began to challenge white feminists' racism and as gay women began to vie for more prominence within feminist organizations. American environmentalism during the 1960s benefited from Americans' increasing use of nature for recreational purposes. Post-war Americans backpacked, they went to the beach, they fished, and they joined birding associations in greater numbers than ever before. And these experiences, along with increased formal education and education in science, made many Americans more aware of the threats to the environment by the new American lifestyle and by industry, and the threats to themselves if the environment was damaged. And many of these threats increased in the post-war years as developers bulldozed open space for suburbs and as new hazards emerged from not only agricultural chemicals, but also industrial pollutants. When biologist Rachel Carson published her landmark book, Silent Spring, in 1962, a new concern for the environment swept through America. Silent Spring argued for interconnectedness of ecological systems and of the ecological world and the human world, and the connectedness between ecological damage and human health. Pesticides that accidentally killed bird populations, Carson argued, could also pose a threat to human health, and DDT was being sprayed everywhere indiscriminately. Carson's argument was compelling to many Americans, including President Kennedy, although it was virulently opposed by chemical industry spokesmen who suggested that this book was just the product of an emotional woman and not a scientist. For the record, Carson was a scientist, and she was also a woman who was fighting cancer because of chemical exposure. After Silent Spring, environmentalism continued to expand rapidly. Earth Day, the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970, was in its time the largest demonstration in American history. But even before this massive gathering for Earth Day, lawmakers from the local to the federal level had begun pushing for regulations to clean up the air and the water. President Richard Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act in 1970, which required environmental impact statements for any project directed or funded by the federal government. Nixon also created the Environmental Protection Agency, the first agency specifically devoted to studying and regulating and disseminating knowledge about the environment. A raft of laws followed to increase protection of air, water, endangered species, and natural areas. To Americans in 1968, the country seemed to be unraveling. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed on April 4th, 1968. He had actually reflected on his own mortality during a rally the night before. He was confident, he said, that the civil rights movement would succeed without him, and he brushed away fears of death. I have been to the mountaintop, he said, and I've seen the promised land. But America wasn't prepared for the loss of its greatest civil rights leader. Riots broke out in over 100 cities. 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was killed, campaigning in California. He had been the last hope of some liberal idealists. So anger and disillusionment washed over the country. And as the Vietnam War descended deeper and deeper into a brutal stalemate, and then the Tet Offensive exposed the lies of the Johnson administration, which I'll talk about in a minute, students began shutting down college campuses and protesting at government facilities. For many 60s idealists, the violence of 1968 represented sort of the death of a dream. Disorder overshadowed hope and progress. And for conservatives, of course, this chaos was a confirmation of all their fears of social breakdown. Americans in 1968 turned their back on hope, a lot of them. They wanted peace and stability. They wanted law and order. There was a very positive break in this dismal slide into chaos in July of 1969, when Americans watched the Apollo 11 moon landing on their TVs and celebrated both the human achievement and the victory in the space race against the Soviet Union. Neil Armstrong's giant leap for mankind fulfilled the promise of the late John F. Kennedy, who had declared in 1961 that the United States would put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth by the end of the decade. But while Americans marveled at the achievement, the brief moment of wonder only kind of punctuated years of turmoil. The Vietnam War disillusioned a generation. Riots rocked cities, protests hit campuses, and assassinations continued to rob the nation of many of its leaders. If the Woodstock Music Festival of August 1969 captured the idealism of the 60s youth culture, the Altamont concert the following December showed its dark side. Drugs, music, and youth could result not only in peace and love, but also in anger and violence and death. While many Americans in the 70s continued to celebrate that political and cultural achievement of the previous decade, a more anxious, conservative mood began to grow across the nation. For some, the United States hadn't gone nearly far enough to promote social justice. For others, of course, it had gone way too far, unfairly trampling on the rights of some people to promote the needs of others. Onto these brewing dissatisfactions, the 1970s also dumped the divisive remnants of a failed war, and then the country's greatest political scandal and an intractable economic crisis. It seemed in the 70s as if the nation was ready to unravel. Perhaps no single issue contributed more to this public disillusionment than the Vietnam War. The Johnson administration, which many believed had begun the war under false pretenses with the Tonkin Resolution, escalated American involvement by deploying hundreds of thousands of troops to prevent this communist takeover of the South by the North. Stalemates, body counts, hazy, ill-defined war aims, and especially the draft produced an anti-war movement that triggered protests throughout the United States and even in Europe. With no end in sight, protesters would burn their draft cards, refuse to pay income tax, occupy government buildings, and delay trains loaded with war materials. By 1967, anti-war demonstrations were drawing hundreds of thousands of people. In one protest, hundreds were arrested after surrounding the Pentagon. Vietnam was also the first American living room war. Open access to the battlefield for reporters provided unprecedented coverage of the conflict's brutality. Americans had to confront grisly images of casualties and also atrocities. In 1965, the CBS Evening News showed U.S. Marines burning the South Vietnamese village of Cam Nay without much regard for the lives of its occupants. The villagers were suspected of aiding Viet Cong guerrillas. Rather than addressing the Marines' actions, President Johnson berated the head of CBS News, yelling at him over the phone, "You boys just shat on the American flag." While the U.S. government didn't go so far as to formally censor the press during Vietnam, the White House and the military used deceptive press briefings and interviews to paint a false image of the war for Americans. The United States was winning the war, officials claimed. They cited numbers of enemies killed, villages secured, quote unquote, and South Vietnamese troops trained. However, American journalists in Vietnam quickly realized the hollowness of these claims, and the press corps began referring to the daily afternoon briefings in Saigon as the 5 o'clock follies. Editors frequently toned down their reporters' pessimism and cynicism, preferring, the misinformation that they received from the government officials that they were in direct contact with. But stories like CBS's Cam Nay piece exposed the credibility gap, which was growing into a huge chasm between the claims of the official sources and the increasingly obvious reality on the ground in Vietnam. Nothing did more to expose this gap than the 1968 Tet Offensive. In January, Communist forces attacked more than 100 American and South Vietnamese sites throughout South Vietnam, including the American embassy in Saigon. U.S. forces did manage to beat back this surprise attack, and they did inflict heavy casualties on the Viet Cong. But the Tet Offensive demonstrated that despite all of the propaganda of administration officials, the enemy could still strike anywhere in the country at will, even after years of war. Later stories and images continue to erode public trust even further. In 1969, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh revealed that U.S. troops had raped and massacred hundreds of civilians in the village of My Lai. 3 years later, Americans cringed at Nick Utt's wrenching photograph of a naked young Chinese girl fleeing an American napalm attack. More and more Americans began to turn against the war. And so, reeling from the war's growing unpopularity, on March 31st, 1968, President Johnson announced on national television that he was not going to seek re-election for a second full term. Eugene McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy battled for the Democratic Party nomination. After Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June, the Democratic Party's national convention in Chicago erupted into violence. When the Democratic Party establishment nominated Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, instead of the popular anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy, the activists protested what they considered to be the hijacking of the process. Demonstrators planned massive protests in Chicago's public spaces. Initial protests were peaceful, but the situation quickly soured as the police began issuing threats and as the young protesters began to taunt and goad them. Many of the assembled students had protest and sit-in experiences really only in the relatively safe confines of college campuses. And they were unprepared for Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago's aggressive and heavily armed police force and National Guard troops in full riot gear. Attendees recounted vicious beatings at the hands of the police and the National Guardsmen. But many young people, remembering the public sympathy that had been won with images of brutality against unarmed protesters during the civil rights movement, continued stoking this violence. Clashes spilled from public parks into the city streets, and eventually the smell of tear gas penetrated into the upper floors of the rich hotels hosting Democratic delegates. Chicago's brutality overshadowed the convention and culminated in an internationally televised violent standoff in front of the Hilton Hotel. "The whole world is watching," the protesters chanted. Local police brutally assaulted protesters on national television. For many Americans, these violent clashes outside the convention hall reinforced their belief that civil society was unraveling. Republican challenger Richard Nixon played on these fears, running on a platform of law and order and a vague plan to end the war. Nixon appealed to what he called the silent majority of Americans. And he called for an honorable end to the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and what he later called peace with honor. Nixon very narrowly edged out Humphrey in the fall's election. Campaign promises of American withdrawal, however, were ignored in a dramatic escalation of the conflict. Looking to force the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table, Nixon pursued what many called a madman strategy of attacking communist supply lines across Laos and Cambodia. Conducted without public knowledge or congressional approval, the bombings failed to spur peace negotiations. The talks stalled before the American-imposed November 1969 deadline. And then news of these illegal attacks in Laos and Cambodia renewed anti-war demonstrations. Police and National Guard units killed 6 college students in separate protests at Jackson State University in Mississippi and Kent State University in Ohio in 1970. Another 3 years passed, and another 20,000 American troops were killed before an agreement was finally reached. After Nixon threatened to withdraw all aid, the North and South Vietnamese governments finally sat down together and signed the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973. And that allowed the U.S. involvement in Vietnam to end. The peace was tenuous and it didn't last long. When the war resumed, North Vietnamese troops quickly overwhelmed the weak Southern forces. By 1975, despite a decade of direct American military engagement, Vietnam was finally united under a communist government. The Vietnam War poisoned many Americans' perceptions of their government and its role in the world. But while anti-war demonstrations attracted a lot of media attention and are remembered today as kind of a hallmark of the 60s counterculture, many Americans were also wary of the protesters and afraid of the rapid social changes that were reshaping American society in the 1960s. And they were worried that the protests threatened an already tenuous civil order. A growing number of Americans, in other words, were turning to conservatism. Now, as I said, facing an unpopular war and inflation and domestic unrest, President Johnson had opted against re-election. The 1968 election was shaped by Vietnam and by social unrest as much as by the campaigns of Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, and former VP Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. And then also the third party challenger, George Wallace, the infamous segregationist governor of Alabama. The Democratic Party was in disarray in 1968 after Senators Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy had both decided to challenge the president, Johnson, in the primary, and then the president had responded with his shocking announcement that he wasn't going to seek re-election. Nixon's candidacy was aided also by the riots that broke out across the country after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and then, of course, the shock of Robert Kennedy's assassination in June and the chaos of the Democratic Convention. The Republicans' campaign was defined by a pledge to restore the peace and prosperity of America to what he called the silent center. He called it the silent center, the millions of people in the middle of the political spectrum. And this campaign for the silent majority was carefully calibrated to attract moderate and conservative suburban Americans by linking the liberals in people's minds with violence and protests and rioting. Meanwhile, Hubert Humphrey struggled to distance himself from Johnson and to maintain working class support in northern cities, where voters were increasingly attracted by George Wallace's appeals to law and order and secretly to rejection of civil rights. Humphrey had union support that helped him in some northern cities, but it really wasn't enough. Nixon won by less than 1%, taking 43.3% of the popular vote against Humphrey's 42.7%. Wallace, meanwhile, captured 5 states in the Deep South, and his 13.5% of the popular vote was a hugely impressive showing for a third-party candidate. Although Republicans won a few seats, Democrats retained control of both the House and the Senate. So Richard Nixon entered the White House in January of 1969 with the opposition party controlling both houses. Nixon focused his energies on American foreign policy, announcing what he called the Nixon Doctrine, which basically said that he was committed to maintaining the supremacy of American democratic capitalism, and he committed the United States to continue supporting its allies financially, but he really denounced previous administrations' willingness to commit American forces into foreign, especially third world conflicts. Nixon told the other nations to take responsibility for their own defense. He turned America away from this idea that it was going to be the policeman of the world and actively contain the communist threat. And he moved towards a new policy of détente with the Soviet Union. And this was promoted by his national security advisor and eventually his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Détente wanted to thaw relations between America and its two now Cold War rivals, the USSR and China. It wanted to freeze the growth of nuclear weapons, and it also wanted to take advantage of tensions between China and the Soviet Union. So Nixon actually pursued closer relations with both in order to strengthen the U.S. position relative to each and, in a sense, divide and conquer. And the strategy seemed to work. Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit communist China in 1971, and he became the first since Franklin Roosevelt had been to Yalta to visit the Soviet Union in 1972. Direct diplomacy and cultural exchange programs with both countries resulted in the formal normalization of U.S.-Chinese relations and also the signing of 2 U.S.-Soviet arms agreements, the Anti-Ballistic or ABM Treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I. By 1973, after almost 30 years of Cold War tension, peaceful coexistence suddenly seemed possible. Soon, though, the calm produced by this thawing of the Cold War gave way to new instability. In November of 1973, Nixon appeared on television to inform Americans that the United States was heading toward the most acute shortages of energy since World War II, in his words. Arab members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, which was a cartel of the world's leading oil producers, had embargoed oil exports to the United States and some of its allies in retaliation for American intervention in the Middle East. The U.S. had just supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, which was a 3-week-long conflict begun by Egypt and Syria in an unsuccessful effort to regain territory that Israel had occupied since the Six-Day War of 1967. The embargo launched the first U.S. energy crisis. By the end of 1973, the global price of oil had quadrupled. Drivers waited in lines for hours to fill up their cars, oftentimes only being allowed to go to the gas station on the odd or even numbered day that matched the last number of their license plates. Gas was rationed, and many stations ran out. OPEC ended the embargo in 1974, but the economic damage had been done. Like the Vietnam War, the oil crisis showed that small countries could still hurt the United States. And like Vietnam, the energy crisis accelerated disenchantment with the U.S. role in the world and with the quality of our leaders. Worse, government scandals began eroding trust in America's public institutions. In 1971, the Nixon administration tried unsuccessfully to sue the New York Times and the Washington Post to prevent the publication of what was called the Pentagon Papers, which was a confidential and very damning history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam that had been commissioned by the Defense Department for its own purposes and then had been leaked to the press. The papers showed that presidents from Truman to Johnson had repeatedly lied to the American public regarding the war's scope and direction. Nixon faced a rising tide of congressional opposition to the war, leading to unprecedented oversight of American war spending. And then in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, which dramatically reduced the president's ability to wage war without congressional consent. However, no scandal did more to destroy public trust than Watergate. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate Hotel complex in Washington, D.C. After being tipped off by a security guard, police found the men attempting to install sophisticated bugging equipment. One of those arrested was a former CIA employee working as a security aide for the Nixon administration's Committee to Re-elect the President. While there was no direct evidence that Nixon had specifically ordered the Watergate break-in, he was in the habit of recording all the conversations that he had with people in the Oval Office. And in one of these secret recordings, investigators found a conversation between Nixon and his chief of staff in which the president ordered that the DNC chairman be illegally wiretapped to obtain the names of the committee's financial supporters. Those names would then be given to the Justice Department and the Internal Revenue Service to investigate their personal affairs and to try to get dirt on them. Nixon was also recorded ordering his chief of staff to break into the offices of the Brookings Institution and take files relating to the war in Vietnam, after saying, "God damn it, get in and get those files. Blow the safe and get it." When news began to get out about the Watergate break-in, the White House launched a massive cover-up. Administration officials ordered the CIA to halt the FBI investigation, which of course the CIA had no authority to do. And they paid hush money to the burglars and to White House aides. Nixon distanced himself from the incident publicly and went on actually to win a landslide election victory against South Dakota Senator George McGovern in November of 1972. But 2 persistent journalists at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, continued to surface information that tied the burglaries ever closer to the CIA, the FBI, and the White House. The Senate held televised hearings. Nixon at first refused to comply with orders to produce those tapes from the White House's secret recording system. Ultimately, he had to comply. In July of 1974, the House Judiciary Committee approved a bill to impeach the president. Nixon resigned before the full House could actually vote on impeachment. He became the first and the only American president ever to resign from office. Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had actually resigned in scandal a year earlier after being implicated in a bribery and tax evasion scheme that was actually unrelated to Watergate. He had been replaced with the leader of the House Republican caucus, Michigan Congressman Gerald Ford. Ford was sworn in as Nixon's successor, and a month later, he granted the disgraced president a full pardon. Nixon disappeared from public life without ever publicly apologizing, accepting responsibility, or facing any charges. The post-war decades that we've talked about before are now remembered as a golden age for American workers. Partially that's due to the fact that it was temporary. Their economic gains were not permanent. But during the 1950s and the 1960s, Americans of all classes did benefit from post-war prosperity. Unemployment was low, and a highly progressive tax system and powerful unions lowered general income inequality. Working class standards of living nearly doubled between 1947 and 1973. Of course, this general prosperity did mask deeper vulnerabilities. And one of the best examples of the decline of American industry is the story of Detroit, Michigan. Detroit had boomed during World War II, when auto manufacturers like Ford and General Motors had converted their assembly lines for the American war effort. Observers had called the city the arsenal of democracy. After the war, however, automobile firms began closing urban factories and moving to the suburbs. Many manufacturing firms began to reduce their labor costs by automating, by downsizing, and by relocating to areas with more business-friendly policies like lower tax rates, anti-union, so-called right-to-work laws, and lower wages. Between 1950 and 1958, Chrysler cut its Detroit production workforce in half. Ford and General Motors eliminated even more of their workforce than Chrysler. In the years between 1953 and 1960, East Detroit lost 10 car plants and over 71,000 jobs. And because Detroit was basically a single industry city, these decisions made by the big three automakers, Ford, Chrysler, and GM, just cascaded across the city's industrial landscape. Ancillary suppliers like machine tool companies were cut out of the supply chain, and they were forced to cut their workforces as well. Between 1947 and 1977, the number of manufacturing firms in Detroit dropped from over 3,000 to fewer than 2,000. Manufacturing jobs fell from 338,400 to only 153,000 over those same 3 decades. Now, this deindustrialization fell heaviest, of course, on the city's African Americans. Although many middle-class black Detroiters did manage to move out of the city, by 1960, 19.7% of black auto workers in Detroit were unemployed, compared to just 5.8% of whites. Over time, Detroit devolved into unemployment and crime and crippled municipal resources. When the riots rocked Detroit in 1967, 25 to 30% of black residents between the ages of 18 and 24 were unemployed. Deindustrialization in Detroit and elsewhere also went hand in hand with a long assault on unionization that began in the aftermath of World War II. Lacking the political support that they had during the New Deal years, the labor unions like the CIO and the UAW shifted their tactics and began accepting labor management agreements in which cooperation rather than agitation and confrontation were the objective. At the same time, bureaucracy and corruption in the unions increasingly weighed them down and alienated both workers and the general public from unions. Conservative politicians grabbed on these popular suspicions of big labor and stepped up their criticism of union leadership and corruption and positioned themselves as the workers' true allies. Labor's decline also reflected ideological changes in American liberalism. By the 1960s, many Democrats had really forsaken working class politics. They began to portray poverty as not the result of structural flaws in the general economy, but as the failure of individuals to take full advantage of the American system and to grab onto American opportunity. Roosevelt's New Deal might have attempted to change unemployment and fix it with government jobs, but Johnson's Great Society and then its imitators down the line tried to use government-sponsored job training, even in places where there would be no jobs for the people trained to get. Union leaders in the 50s and 60s typically supported these types of programs and philosophies. And then internal racism also weakened the labor movement. While the CIO leaders had encouraged black unionization from the 1930s onward, white workers often opposed integrated shops. In Detroit and elsewhere after World War II, white workers often organized what they called hate strikes and walked off the job rather than work with African Americans. And like the middle class, white workers also opposed residential integration, claiming that black newcomers in their neighborhoods would destroy their property values. By the mid-1970s, this widely shared post-war prosperity that America had enjoyed leveled off and began to retreat. Growing international competition and the technical inefficiency of industries that had decided to pay profits out to their shareholders rather than reinvesting, and also declining productivity began to stunt working and middle class pay. As the country entered a recession triggered by the oil shock in 1973, wages decreased and the pay gap between workers and management began to expand, which reversed 3 decades of post-war contraction. The tax code became less progressive and labor lost its foothold in the marketplace. Unions had represented a third of the workforce in the 1950s, but only 1 in 10 workers belonged to a union as of 2015. American firms fled from pro-labor states in what became known as the Rust Belt in the 1970s and 1980s. Some went overseas in the wake of new trade treaties to exploit foreign low-wage workers, but others turned to anti-union states in the South and the West. Factories closed in the North and the Midwest, and that led commentators to begin calling these regions the Rust Belt, and specifically to contrast them with the new Sun Belt. Southern and Western states saw unprecedented economic and industrial and demographic growth after World War II. During the New Deal, if you recall, President Roosevelt had declared the American South was the nation's #1 economic problem, and he had injected massive federal subsidies and investments and then military spending into the region to build them up. During the Cold War, Sun Belt politicians had lobbied hard for more military installations and government contracts for their states. And Southern states' hostility towards organized labor attracted corporate leaders. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 continued to facilitate cheap, non-unionized labor low wages, and lax regulations that pulled northern industries away from the Rust Belt down to the Sun Belt. Skilled northern workers followed these new jobs southward and westward, and took advantage of cheap housing and the warm climate, which all of a sudden was being made more tolerable by modern air conditioning. The South attracted businesses by promising firms that they wouldn't be called on to share too much of their profits. Middle-class whites grew rich, but often these were recent transplants and not native Southerners. As the decaying cotton economy shed more and more farmers and workers, poor white and black Southerners found themselves mostly excluded from the fruits of this Sun Belt boom. Public investments were scarce. White Southern politicians channeled federal funding away from public education and elementary schools and high schools towards high-tech industry and university-level research, if there was any education funding at all. The Sun Belt had growing numbers of very high-skill, high-wage jobs, but lacked the social and the educational infrastructure they would have needed to train native, poor, and middle-class workers for those jobs. So they came from someplace else. Regardless, more jobs meant more people. And by 1972, Southern and Western Sun Belt states had more voters than the Northeast and the Midwest. And the gap continues to grow. And although the region's economic and political success was the product of massive federal spending from the New Deal onwards, not only in government contracts, but also in infrastructure investments to provide everything from electricity to services like drinking water in these states. New right politicians began constructing a political brand that was centered on small government, that found loyal support in the Sun Belt. These business-friendly politicians combined Protestantism and free market ideology to create a new conservative movement. These Sun Belt suburbanites were prosperous and mobile, and they liked this individualistic vision of free enterprise that was now being espoused by the Republican Party. And some, especially people who were vocally anti-communist, joined groups like the Young Americans for Freedom or the John Birch Society. Less radical suburban voters, however, even so, still gravitated toward the more moderate brand of conservatism that was promoted by people like Richard Nixon. The sexual revolution continued from the 1960s into the 70s. Many Americans, including feminists and gay men and lesbians and straight couples, challenged the strict gender roles and rejected the rigidity of the nuclear family that had been promoted by the media in the 50s. Cohabitation, living together without marriage, increased, and many couples married later or just not at all, and divorce rates climbed substantially. Sexuality, which was decoupled by things like oral contraceptives, the pill, was decoupled from marriage and procreation, and it became, for many people, not only a source of individual expression and entertainment, but also a political cause. A landmark ruling in 1973 that established the battle lines of the sex wars in the 70s was the Supreme Court's 7-2 decision on Roe v. Wade that recognized the constitutional right to privacy, which allowed women to have abortions. The court reasoned that this right to privacy, they said, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. The court decreed that states could not interfere with a woman's right to an abortion during the first trimester of pregnancy and could only fully prohibit abortions during the third trimester. A woman's right to control her own body paralleled the fight for more control in women's relationships. Between 1959 and 1979, the American divorce rate more than doubled. By the early 1980s, nearly half of all American marriages ended in divorce. The stigma attached to divorce evaporated over this time, and a growing sense of personal and sexual freedom motivated women to leave unfulfilling or abusive marriages. Legal changes also promoted higher divorce rates as well. Before 1969, most states required, in order for a divorce, most states required one spouse to prove that the other was guilty of a specific offense, such as adultery. In 1969, California adopted the first no-fault divorce law. By the end of the 70s, almost every state had adopted some form of no-fault divorce. The new laws allowed for divorce on the basis of what they called irreconcilable differences. And they allowed it even if only one party felt that he or she didn't want to stay in the marriage. Gay men and women, meanwhile, negotiated a harsh world that stigmatized homosexuality as a mental illness or an immoral depravity. But inspired by the radicalism of the Black Power movement and by protests of the Vietnam War and the counterculture movement for sexual freedom, gay and lesbian activists began agitating for a broader set of sexual rights of their own. And this activism was demonstrated in a 1969 uprising at the Stonewall Inn in New York's Greenwich Village. Police would regularly raid gay bars and hangouts. But in June of 1969, Stonewall patrons fought back and protested and began a multi-day street battle that sparked a national movement for gay liberation. After Stonewall, gay activists increasingly began attacking the cultural norms that demanded that they keep their sexuality hidden. They cited statistics that sexual secrecy contributed to suicide, and so they urged people to come out and embrace their sexuality. A step towards the normalization of homosexuality occurred in 1973 when the American Psychiatric Association stopped classifying homosexuality as a mental illness in the diagnostic manual, the DSM. And pressure mounted on politicians. In 1982, Wisconsin became the first state to ban discrimination based on sexual orientation. And more than 80 cities and 9 states followed suit over the following decade. But progress proceeded unevenly, and gay Americans continued to suffer hardships from a hostile culture. Although Richard Nixon eluded prosecution, Watergate continued to weigh on voters' minds. It produced big congressional gains for Democrats in the 1974 midterm elections, and then Gerald Ford's pardon of Nixon destroyed his chances in the 1976 presidential race. Former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, who was a nuclear physicist and a peanut farmer who represented a new generation of younger, more racially liberal New South Democrats, captured the Democratic nomination. Carter didn't identify either with his party's liberal or conservative wings. His appeal was more personal than political. He was an outsider, and he didn't run on any great political issues. Instead, he let his background as a hardworking, honest Southern Baptist Navy man ingratiate him to voters around the country. Carter was especially popular in the South, where support for Democrats had wavered in the wake of the civil rights movement and then George Wallace's racist challenge. Carter's wholesome image was a stark contrast to the memory of Nixon, and his government experience from outside of Washington gave him a big advantage over the Beltway insider Ford, who had pardoned Nixon. When Carter took the oath of office in January 1977, however, he inherited a country in the midst of economic turmoil. Oil shocks, inflation, stagnant growth, unemployment, and sinking wages all weighed down the American economy. Some of these problems were the consequences of U.S. decisions, specifically decisions to rebuild the shattered economies in Europe and Asia after World War II and during the Cold War. American diplomats had used trade relationships to win influence and allies around the globe. And they saw the economic health of their allies, particularly West Germany and Japan, as crucial in fighting the expansion of communism. American aid, investment, and special import-export privileges encouraged these nations to develop powerful export-oriented economies, which actually came at a great cost competitively to the United States. As U.S. firms began moving to the Sun Belt to escape unions and began preferring to pay high shareholder dividends rather than reinvesting in new techniques and technologies, foreign firms invested heavily, and they innovated, and they created new stakeholder systems that included unions and even communities in management decision-making. While the American economy stalled, Japan and West Germany soared and became major forces in the global production of autos, steel, machine tools, and electrical products. The two biggest car companies in the world are now the Volkswagen conglomerate and the Toyota conglomerate. While the American economy stalled, the rest of the world soared. The value of American exports dropped, and the prices of its imports skyrocketed. And coupled with the huge cost of the Vietnam War, which had cost American taxpayers between $100 and $150 billion, and the rise of the oil-producing states in the Middle East, the growing trade deficits that America was facing sapped our dominant position in the global economy. American leaders didn't know how to respond. The Nixon administration had allowed these rising industrial nations to maintain trade agreements that sheltered their domestic markets from foreign competition while they were able to export growing numbers of products to the U.S. By 1974, in response to American complaints, many of these industrial nations began revising their protectionist practices, but then that allowed them to develop subtler methods like state subsidies for key industries to continue nurturing their economies. The result was that Carter, like Ford and Nixon before him, presided over this new economic problem: simultaneous inflation and economic stagnation, which became known as stagflation. Neither Ford nor Carter had any ideas or really any ambitions to protect American jobs and goods from foreign competition. American foreign policy had set up this trend toward globalization and had basically set it in motion. And American policymakers couldn't even really agree on whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, much less do anything about it. As firms and financial institutions invested, as they sold goods and as they manufactured more products in these new rising economies, like not only Germany and Japan, but Mexico, Taiwan, Brazil, and elsewhere, American politicians allowed them to sell their cheaper goods in the U.S. With the American government institutionalizing this new unfettered global trade, if only by inaction, a lot of American manufacturers looked at that and reasoned that the only viable path to sustained profitability was to move overseas, often by just picking up their factories and putting them someplace else, often by investing in foreign firms or establishing foreign subsidiaries. Investment capital, especially in manufacturing, fled the United States looking for foreign investments, which hastened the destruction of the productivity of American industry. During the 1976 presidential campaign, Carter had pointed to what he called the misery index, which he defined as the sum of the unemployment rate added to the inflation rate. And he had used this as an indictment of both Gerald Ford and generally of the Republican Party. But Carter was unable to slow this unraveling of the American economy. And unemployment and inflation continued to rise. and continued to damage his presidency. But although Carter was unable to really offer domestic policies to fix the American economy, his idealistic vision of human rights in foreign policy had some successes and some failures. Carter hadn't made human rights a central theme of his campaign, but in May 1977, he did declare his desire to move away from a foreign policy which he said was characterized by an inordinate fear of communism, and that caused American leaders to, in his words, adopt the flawed and erroneous principles and tactics of our adversaries. Carter proposed instead a policy based on constant decency in its values and on optimism in our historical vision. Carter's idealistic human rights policy tried to repair the damage done by the cynical foreign policies of his predecessors. He did achieve some real victories. The U.S. did reduce or eliminate aid to several American-supported right-wing dictators that were guilty of extreme human rights abuses in places like South Korea, Argentina, and the Philippines. And in September 1977, Carter negotiated the transfer to Panama of the Panama Canal, which cost him a lot of political capital in the United States. A year later, in September 1978, Carter negotiated a peace treaty between the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. The Camp David Accords represented the first time that an Arab state had ever recognized the state of Israel as a legitimate political entity, and the first time that Israel promised Palestinian self-government. The Accords had limits, but both Israel and the Palestinians saw it as a major step forward, and it was a major policy achievement for Carter. And yet, Carter's dreams of a human rights-based foreign policy kind of crumbled in front of the Cold War and the realities of American politics. The United States continued to provide military aid and financial support for dictatorial regimes that were vital to American interests. A specific example was the oil-rich state of Iran. When the U.S.-supported Shah was deposed in November 1979, revolutionaries stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. Americans not only experienced another oil crisis as Iran shut down its oil fields, they also had to watch American news coverage for 444 days that continued to remind them that the hostages were still being held, continuing demonstration of America's new global impotence. Carter couldn't get them released. He tried to send a rescue mission, which failed and ended in the deaths of 8 American servicemen. And Carter's efforts to ease the Cold War more with a new nuclear arms control agreement disintegrated under domestic opposition from conservative Cold War hawks such as Ronald Reagan, who accused Carter of weakness. A month after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, Carter had to commit the U.S. to defending its interests in the Middle East against Soviet incursions. The Carter Doctrine, as it was called, not only signaled Jimmy Carter's difficulty in honoring his commitment to de-escalation and human rights, it also was a sign of his increasingly desperate presidency. With the collapse of American manufacturing, the rise of inflation, and the sudden impotence of America in foreign policy, a sense of unraveling really began to pervade the nation. In a surprise televised address in July of 1979, Jimmy Carter went on TV and said, "I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. The president said that the nation was suffering from a malaise that was partly due to the growing energy crisis, but was also something deeper. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways, Carter said. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. American weakness was visible everywhere. And so by 1980, many Americans, especially white, middle, and upper class Americans, began to feel a nostalgic desire for simpler times and simpler answers to the frustrating, complex geopolitical and social and economic problems that were facing the country. The earlier appeal of Carter's Southern drawl and his Christian humility had been a signal of this yearning, but his failure to stop this unraveling of American power and confidence opened the door to a new movement that promised to do more and undo the damage and restore the United States to its own nostalgic image of itself. And we'll cover that next time. But that is all for now. So I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again next time.